In a small, tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other by name and neighbors often shared a cup of coffee on the porch, I found myself embroiled in an ongoing conflict with none other than Karen. To say our relationship was strained would be an understatement. Karen had a reputation, one that preceded her like a storm cloud on a sunny day. She was known for her stubbornness and her relentless pursuit of whatever she deemed necessary, often at the expense of others. It all began innocently enough. I had recently purchased my plot of land on the outskirts of town, excited to cultivate my little piece of paradise. The property boasted sprawling fields, towering trees, and a charming old barn that whispered stories of its past. It was everything I had dreamed of, a sanctuary where I could escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. However, as I began to settle in, I quickly realized that my idyllic retreat came with its own set of challenges. Enter Karen. From the moment I moved in, she seemed to take it upon herself to assert her presence on my land. At first, it was minor annoyances. She would wander over to offer unsolicited advice about gardening or complain about the noise from my barn renovations. While I appreciated her enthusiasm for community interaction, her persistence began to feel invasive. It was as if she believed my property extended beyond its marked boundaries, an unwritten rule that she felt entitled to disregard. The situation escalated when Karen began to bring her friends over for picnics right at the edge of my property line. Each time I spotted her lounging with a group of people just a few feet from my carefully tended flower beds, irritation bubbled within me. I would step outside, clear my throat loudly, perhaps even wave awkwardly in hopes of signaling them to move along. But Karen always waved back with that infuriatingly cheerful smile as if to say, "What's the big deal?" Despite my attempts to communicate my discomfort with her behavior, Karen appeared undeterred. She dismissed my concerns with offhand comments about community ownership and shared spaces. It was frustrating because I had been nothing but polite. After all, who wants to be the bad neighbor? But her disregard for my boundaries felt increasingly brazen. Things took a turn for the worse one sunny afternoon when I returned home from running errands only to find Karen and her friends having an impromptu barbecue right on my lawn. The sight of their picnic tables laden with food and laughter ringing through the air sent me over the edge. My heart raced as I marched toward them, fueled by a mix of disbelief and anger. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising tide of frustration within me. "This is private property." Karen looked up from her plate, clearly surprised but not particularly concerned. "Oh, come on. We're just having some fun. You should join us," she replied without an ounce of remorse. I took a deep breath, trying to muster patience. "I appreciate your enthusiasm for outdoor gatherings, but you really need to move off my land." In that moment, something shifted in our dynamic. Instead of simply brushing off my request this time, she became defensive and confronted me head-on. A verbal tussle ensued that left me reeling. Words were exchanged that day, words laced with tension and frustration, each one driving a deeper wedge into our already fragile relationship. It was clear that simple discussions weren't enough. Something more drastic needed to be done to reclaim my space and send a message that Karen could no longer ignore the boundaries I had set. As days turned into weeks, Karen continued her defiance while I pondered solutions. Each encounter left me feeling more helpless and frustrated than before. Friends advised me to be firm and assertive. Others suggested contacting local authorities or even seeking legal advice. But deep down, I wanted this resolved amicably without escalating into something that would tarnish the neighborhood's peace. Ultimately, it became evident that words alone would not suffice. My patience was wearing thin. It was time for action. So there I stood one morning, coffee in hand and determination set in stone as I considered installing an electric fence around the perimeter of my property. A bold move for sure, but one that felt necessary given how far things had gone with Karen. Little did I know at that moment how this decision would transform not only my life, but also how Karen viewed boundaries forevermore. What started as an innocent conflict over property rights was about to take a shocking turn, one that neither of us could have anticipated but would definitely leave its mark on our community dynamics. To truly understand the escalating conflict between Karen and me, it's essential to delve into the background of my property. I'd always dreamed of owning a piece of land where I could create my sanctuary, a place that echoed with the sounds of nature and tranquility. After years of searching, I finally found it, a charming plot on the outskirts of town, just far enough from the bustling center to feel like an escape, yet close enough to remain part of the community. The land was rich with history, having once belonged to an old farmhouse that had stood for generations. Though the house itself had long since fallen into disrepair and was eventually demolished, remnants of its past remained. An ancient well tucked away behind a grove of trees, a weathered barn that stood proudly despite the passage of time, and wildflowers that danced in the breeze each spring. The moment I stepped onto this property, I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. It was as if the land was calling out to me, ready to be nurtured back to life. As I began to settle in, I envisioned turning the barn into a workshop where I could pursue my hobbies, perhaps even hosting small gatherings with friends and family. The expansive fields provided ample space for gardening, and I dreamed of planting rows of vibrant vegetables and fragrant herbs. It was my intention to cultivate not just crops but also a sense of community, inviting neighbors over for seasonal harvests or simple barbecues under the stars. But my vision for this property was quickly overshadowed by Karen's unyielding presence. From the very start, it became clear that my desires for peaceful solitude clashed sharply with her view of communal living. In her mind, boundaries were merely suggestions. My land became just another extension of her world where she felt entitled to roam freely. The conflict seemed almost surreal at times. Each morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch overlooking the fields, I'd find myself contemplating how I could transform this land into a haven while simultaneously fending off Karen's encroachments. With every passing day, it became increasingly clear that maintaining my vision for this property would require more than just gardening skills and creativity. It would demand vigilance and courage. I remember one particular afternoon when I decided to take a walk around my property to survey how it was coming along. As I strolled along the tree line, admiring how nature was slowly reclaiming parts of the old barn, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching me. Glancing over my shoulder, I spotted Karen peering through the trees at me as if she were inspecting my every move. It struck me as odd. This wasn't just a neighborly curiosity. It felt invasive. In that moment, I recognized that my sanctuary was under threat not only from her physical presence, but also from her disregard for what this land meant to me. It wasn't just dirt and grass. It represented dreams and aspirations, the culmination of years spent envisioning a lifestyle rooted in peace and self-sufficiency. As time went on, I learned more about the history surrounding my property from neighbors who had lived in the area much longer than I had. They spoke fondly of barbecues held in the yard during summer nights and stories about the old farmhouse that once stood proudly on site. The land had been a gathering place for many families over decades, stories intertwined with laughter echoing through its fields. However, as much as I cherished these histories, they only fueled my frustration when faced with Karen's incessant intrusions. Every time she wandered onto my property uninvited or set up camp near my garden beds, it felt like she was dismissively erasing all those memories and aspirations that made this place special to me. Moreover, there were practical challenges tied to maintaining this property as well. There were days when storms rolled in unexpectedly, threatening crops and causing damage to the barn's exterior. Managing these issues alone was daunting enough without having to battle external distractions from someone who didn't seem to respect either my time or efforts. With each encounter growing more strained than the last, it became evident that protecting what I had built, both physically and emotionally, was paramount. My property represented not just land, but also sanctuary. It symbolized everything I had longed for, a refuge from chaos where dreams could flourish. As tensions simmered beneath the surface between Karen's relentless intrusions and my determination to safeguard my space, I knew something had to change. My vision for this property depended not only on nurturing its beauty, but also on establishing boundaries firmly rooted in respect, a lesson Karen was about to learn in an unexpected way. In the months that followed my move to the property, I found myself embroiled in a series of increasingly tense encounters with Karen. Each meeting added another chapter to our conflict, revealing not just her obstinacy, but also my mounting frustration. What began as minor irritations quickly escalated into confrontations that would test my patience and resolve. The first notable incident occurred shortly after I had settled in. It was a bright Saturday morning, and I was outside tending to my garden. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything felt perfect as I dug my hands into the warm earth. Just as I was about to plant a row of tomatoes, I noticed movement at the edge of my property. There was Karen, ambling along with her dog, seemingly unaware that she had crossed onto my land. I paused, unsure whether to approach her or let it slide for the moment. But as she continued walking deeper into my yard, I felt compelled to intervene. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my tone friendly yet firm. "You are on my property." Karen turned, looking genuinely surprised. "Oh, really? I didn't see any signs," she replied casually, as if wandering onto someone else's land were acceptable because she hadn't spotted a warning. I gestured toward the boundary line marked by overgrown bushes and an old fence post that still stood resolutely in the ground. "This is my property line. The fence is just a little hard to see," I explained. She waved her hand dismissively. "It's just a bit of land. We're neighbors. Why can't we share?" That comment struck a nerve. Sharing is one thing. Intruding is quite another. I took a deep breath and reiterated my boundaries more firmly, hoping she would understand. Unfortunately, this encounter only set the stage for many more to come. A few weeks later, during a sunny afternoon barbecue with friends, I noticed Karen again, this time perched on her lawn chair just beyond my property line, watching us with a keen interest as if we were an exhibit at a fair. While I appreciated community spirit, her presence felt invasive. Unable to ignore the discomfort bubbling inside me any longer, I decided to confront her directly. "Hey, Karen," I called out with forced cheerfulness. "Are you planning on joining us?" She smiled brightly and replied, "Oh no, just enjoying the view." My stomach churned at her nonchalant attitude. "It's great you're enjoying it," I said cautiously, "but do you mind keeping your distance? We're trying to have a private gathering." Rather than respecting my request, Karen shrugged and said casually, "But it's such a nice day. Why should we all hide away?" Her response felt like salt in an open wound. What happened to basic respect for privacy? After exchanging frustrated words back and forth until both our faces were flushed with irritation, I retreated back into the house feeling defeated. The incidents continued piling up over the following weeks, each one more ludicrous than the last. One evening while pulling weeds from my flower bed, I looked up to find Karen leaning against one of my trees, casually chatting with another neighbor who had come over for advice on their yard work. It was as if she viewed every part of my land as communal space. "Hey there. Just borrowing some shade while waiting for Bob," she said cheerfully when she noticed me glaring at her from across the yard. "Borrowing shade?" I muttered under my breath before forcing a smile and approaching them. "Karen, this is private property." Her response was infuriatingly lighthearted. "Come on. It's just a tree." Each encounter chipped away at whatever patience I had left. It seemed clear that Karen viewed boundaries differently than most people did. They were merely lines on paper rather than limits deserving of respect and consideration. Things reached a boiling point when she brought over her family one weekend for what she called an impromptu picnic right next to my garden beds, the very ones that contained delicate seedlings I had nurtured since spring. As laughter rang through the air while they spread out blankets on the grass mere feet from where I stood fuming inside my house, it was clear that enough was enough. With every confrontation growing more exasperating than the last and no sign of Karen slowing down her trespassing tendencies anytime soon, it became glaringly obvious that any hope for resolution through polite conversation was fading fast. The situation demanded action, decisive action, to reclaim not only control over my land, but also restore peace of mind. I began contemplating solutions that would not only protect my garden, but also send a clear message about respecting boundaries. without escalating things further or damaging any semblance of neighborly relations in our community. Little did Karen know that what would come next would serve as both an eye-opener for her and an unexpected twist in our ongoing saga. A shocking lesson awaited both of us as I prepared to take steps towards safeguarding what had become so precious to me, my home and sanctuary. After countless encounters with Karen that had left me feeling frustrated and disrespected, I knew it was time to take action. My patience had worn thin, and it became clear that polite discussions had failed to establish the necessary boundaries. It was no longer just about my desire for peace. It was about reclaiming control over my own property. That's when I decided to install an electric fence, a decision that felt both drastic and liberating. The process began with research. I spent hours online, poring over articles and forum discussions about the pros and cons of electric fencing. I wanted to make an informed choice, ensuring that this solution would effectively deter Karen without causing permanent harm or excessive distress. As I read through various experiences shared by others, I learned how effective electric fences could be in keeping trespassers at bay while still allowing for a level of safety when properly installed. I discovered that modern electric fences were designed to deliver a mild shock that would discourage anyone from crossing the line without causing any long-term damage. This feature appealed to me. I didn't want to hurt anyone, just send a clear message that my boundaries needed to be respected. With this newfound knowledge, I made a list of materials I would need, including insulated posts, wiring, and an energizer unit. The following weekend, I gathered everything I needed from a local hardware store. As I loaded the materials into my truck, I felt a surge of determination coursing through me. This was no longer just about protecting my garden or enjoying my space. It was about standing up for myself and reclaiming what was mine. Once home, I set to work immediately. The sun hung high in the sky as I began measuring out the perimeter of my property line, taking care to ensure that the fence would clearly mark where Karen could go and where she could not. Each step felt like an act of defiance against her continued trespassing. I carefully positioned the posts into the ground at regular intervals, visualizing how this barrier would soon become a protective shield around my sanctuary. As dusk began to settle in, I threaded the wire through each post, feeling a sense of accomplishment with every loop completed. The installation took time and effort, much more than I had initially anticipated. But as night fell and the last bit of wiring was secured in place, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. With everything finally set up, I stood back and admired my handiwork under the glow of the moonlight. The fence wasn't just functional. It was symbolic, a physical manifestation of my determination to establish boundaries that should have been respected from the beginning. Now came the moment of truth, activating the fence. Standing there in the cool night air, heart racing slightly with anticipation, I flipped the switch on the energizer unit. A soft hum filled the air as electricity surged through the wires, bringing my creation to life. The faint crackle was reassuring. This was no mere deterrent. It was a clear warning. As days turned into weeks after installation, life resumed its usual rhythm for me, while always underpinned by an undercurrent of anticipation regarding Karen's next move. Would she notice? How would she react? There was an undeniable thrill in knowing that soon enough, she would encounter this new reality on her next stroll onto my land. The opportunity came sooner than expected during one particularly warm afternoon when I spotted her walking her dog along what she probably considered her usual route. My heart raced as I watched her approach the boundary line. Would she cross it again? My stomach tightened as she stepped closer with that familiar casual air about her. I held my breath as she paused at my newly erected fence, examining it with curiosity. My mind raced with thoughts. Would she respect it? Would she finally understand that this was not just another invitation for her to intrude? Then came the moment we'd both been waiting for, but in entirely different ways. Karen sidestepped along the perimeter before leaning in closer for a better look at the posts. "What's this?" she called out playfully. "A new decoration?" Before I could respond or even prepare myself for what happened next, she reached out and touched one of the wires with her hand. The shock came instantaneously, a jolt that sent her stumbling back as she yelped in surprise. The look on her face shifted from amusement to utter disbelief as she realized what had happened. In that electrifying moment, something inside me shifted too, part relief, part vindication, as Karen stood there processing what had just occurred. It wasn't just a lesson for her. It was a reminder that boundaries matter and that sometimes we must take bold actions to protect what we hold dear. As she regained her composure and retreated from what had become an unmistakable barrier between us, I felt a wave of triumph wash over me. Perhaps now Karen would think twice before stepping onto my land again, or at least learn to respect the boundaries that should have been understood all along. Despite the shocking lesson Karen had just received, I quickly realized that my victory might be short-lived. The very next day, as I tended to my garden, I spotted her once more, this time standing at the edge of my property with an incredulous look on her face. She had come to inspect the electric fence, this time with a newfound determination rather than fear. The moment I saw her, I felt a mix of anxiety and frustration. My hopes that she would finally back off were rapidly fading. "Hey," she called out, waving enthusiastically. "I see you've put up quite the barrier. But, it's not really going to stop me, right?" I couldn't believe my ears. Was she truly dismissing the lesson she had just learned? "Karen," I replied, keeping my tone calm despite the irritation boiling within me. "You touched the fence yesterday. You felt how it works. This is meant to keep you off my property." "Oh, please," she laughed, an air of defiance in her voice. "A little shock isn't going to scare me away forever. I've got a pretty high pain tolerance, As she stood there boldly challenging me, it became apparent that Karen's stubbornness was more profound than I had initially thought. It seemed that my electric fence had not deterred her, but instead ignited a rebellious spark within her, a determination to test the limits of what she could get away with on my land. The following days turned into a series of bizarre encounters. Despite knowing that crossing the boundary meant facing an unpleasant shock, Karen seemed undeterred by the risk. She began devising elaborate strategies to circumvent the fence altogether. I watched in disbelief as she would sneak around, trying to find gaps or weak spots where she could potentially enter without triggering the electric charge. One afternoon, while checking on my vegetable patch, I was startled to hear rustling nearby. When I turned around, there was Karen attempting to scale a tree that bordered my property. Her determination was almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. "What are you doing?" I shouted from across the yard. "Oh, just getting a better view. You've made your place look so lovely," she called back cheerfully as if that somehow justified her actions. I couldn't believe it. Was this woman really climbing trees to get a glimpse into my private space? What could possibly be wrong with her? My frustration mounted as I realized that this was no longer just about boundaries. It had become a game for Karen, and she was playing it for all it was worth. It dawned on me that each encounter only fueled her defiance further. Rather than retreating in fear or embarrassment after our previous clash, Karen appeared emboldened by it, a fact that left me feeling both exasperated and powerless. It wasn't just about one individual. It felt like an entire community dynamic was shifting because of this ongoing battle of wills. Days turned into weeks as Karen's antics escalated. She would bring friends over to taunt me from afar, laughing and joking while standing just outside my property line as if daring me to confront her again. It felt increasingly surreal watching them frolic while I stood on my side of the fence, fuming silently. Despite her apparent enjoyment in pushing back against my boundaries, there's another side to Karen's behavior that began to emerge, passive-aggressive comments that seemed designed to undermine my resolve. During one encounter at a community event, she approached me with a fake smile plastered on her face and said loudly enough for others to hear, "It must be exhausting putting up all those barriers. It's much nicer when we can share everything." I could feel heat rising in my cheeks as other neighbors glanced over at us, some suppressing smiles while others looked genuinely concerned for me. "Sharing is one thing," I shot back carefully, trying not to escalate things further in public, "but invading someone's personal space is another." But Karen simply shrugged and laughed it off as if I were being overly sensitive. As these incidents piled up, I realized that simply having an electric fence wouldn't solve everything if Karen remained resolute in testing its limits. Her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. It was clear she relished challenging me and asserting herself against what she perceived as an encroachment on her own sense of community freedom. With each passing day, I found myself grappling with frustration and disbelief at how someone could be so determined to disregard boundaries meant for mutual respect. I knew something needed to change beyond just defending my property line. I needed a strategy to curb her defiance once and for all. As I contemplated my next steps in this ongoing saga with Karen and how best to protect both myself and my sanctuary, I began brainstorming potential solutions that went beyond mere physical barriers alone. Perhaps there were ways not only to reinforce boundaries but also communicate clearly what my land represented, both for me personally and within our community dynamics. Little did either of us know how things would soon escalate yet again, but take an unexpected turn, one that would lead both Karen and me toward an uncharted territory neither of us anticipated. After weeks of Karen's relentless defiance, the tension between us had reached a boiling point. I could feel it in the air, both her determination to challenge my boundaries and my own frustration simmering just below the surface. It was as if we were two opposing forces locked in an unyielding standoff, each waiting for the other to make a move. One sunny afternoon, I was working on some repairs to the barn when I suddenly heard laughter drifting through the trees. Curiosity piqued, I stepped outside to take a look. To my dismay, I saw Karen again, this time accompanied by a small group of her friends. They were gathered just beyond my electric fence, clearly enjoying themselves while chatting and joking about the fence that had become the talk of the neighborhood. I watched from a distance as she pointed at the fence, her laughter ringing out as she exaggeratedly mimicked what it must have been like to touch it. Can you believe it? A little zap. What a dramatic way to keep people away, she exclaimed, her friends chuckling along with her. The sight of this group laughing at my expense ignited a spark of anger within me. I couldn't stand idly by while they mocked what I had installed out of necessity. Gathering my resolve, I decided to confront them once more. Karen, I called out firmly as I approached. What are you doing this time? You know that crossing this line is off limits. She turned toward me with that infuriatingly bright smile on her face. Oh, don't be so serious. We're just having a little fun, she said dismissively. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain control over my emotions. Fun or not, you need to respect my property and stop treating it like a playground. Her expression shifted slightly, but instead of taking my words seriously, she replied with feigned innocence. But I'm just curious. What's life without a little adventure? At that moment, something inside me snapped. It was as if Karen had crossed an invisible line, a point where curiosity morphed into blatant disregard for my rights as a property owner. Adventure? I echoed incredulously. This isn't an adventure. It's disrespect. Before I could continue, Karen turned back toward her friends and waved them closer as if inviting them to join her in crossing that boundary. My heart raced as I realized what she intended to do. She was daring them to get close enough to test the electric fence for themselves. Come on, let's see if it really works, she called out playfully, egging on her friends who looked both hesitant and intrigued. In that moment, adrenaline surged through me. I shouted again, desperation creeping into my voice. Karen, don't do this. You're just asking for trouble. But my words fell on deaf ears as she stepped forward with exaggerated bravado. Her friends giggled nervously, but seemed unable to pull away from the spectacle unfolding before them. Then came the moment that would forever change our dynamic. Karen reached out and touched the electric wire again, but this time with more reckless abandon than before. The shock hit her instantly, sending her stumbling backward in surprise. Her expression transformed from playful bravado to shock and disbelief in an instant. It was as if time slowed down for me as I watched everything unfold before my eyes. The laughter that had filled the air moments earlier turned into gasps of surprise from her friends who quickly realized what had just happened. Stumbling back onto the grass, Karen clutched her arm and exclaimed, "What the hell?" I rushed forward instinctively, concern washing over me despite everything that had transpired between us. "Are you okay?" She glared up at me from where she sat on the ground. That defiant spark in her eyes was replaced by something else. A mix of embarrassment and frustration mingled together as she processed what had just occurred. "I can't believe you had actually set up something like this," she shouted angrily, still reeling from the shock she'd experienced not only physically but emotionally too. "Karen," I said cautiously but firmly, "I warned you multiple times not to cross this boundary." Her friends stood awkwardly nearby, unsure how to react. Some looked concerned for Karen, while others exchanged glances that hinted at their own disbelief at how far things had escalated. As Karen got back on her feet, still shaken but regaining composure, I could see how deeply unsettled she was by what had just happened. It wasn't just about the shock. It was about realizing that actions have consequences, a lesson she had resisted learning for so long. "I'll be fine," she huffed defensively while brushing herself off, but there was an edge in her tone now, a hint of vulnerability mixed with indignation. I took a step back, realizing this moment might finally serve as a turning point in our ongoing conflict. Maybe now she would understand that boundaries mattered and crossing them could lead not only to discomfort but also to serious consequences. "Just think about what you've done," I urged gently but firmly. "You can't keep testing limits without expecting some kind of reaction." As her friends began murmuring supportively around her while helping gather their things to leave, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, mixed with trepidation about what this meant moving forward. Maybe this shocking incident would finally serve as a wake-up call for Karen, a chance for both of us to reevaluate what we wanted out of our interactions as neighbors and perhaps even start fresh from here on out. As the dust settled from the shocking incident, an uneasy silence enveloped the area. I watched as Karen's friends quickly gathered their belongings, casting furtive glances between her and me, clearly unsure of how to navigate the sudden tension that had erupted. The laughter that had once filled the air was now replaced by a heavy atmosphere of uncertainty. Karen, still visibly shaken from her encounter with the electric fence, stood with her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving behind an expression that oscillated between anger and disbelief. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, processing not only the shock but also what this incident meant for our ongoing conflict. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously, trying to gauge her physical state while also acknowledging the emotional impact of what had just occurred. She shot me a glare that could have wilted flowers. "Do I look okay?" She snapped back defensively, brushing off any concern I might have had. That was completely unnecessary. I took a deep breath, ready to respond, but aware that this wasn't the moment to escalate things further. "I warned you about crossing the boundary," I replied calmly. "This was meant to protect my property, not to harm you." Her friends began to murmur among themselves, their expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort as they observed Karen's reaction. It felt surreal to witness this shift. The bold woman who had so confidently mocked my efforts was now standing there vulnerable and defensive. "I can't believe you thought it was a good idea to set up something like this," she said, her voice trembling slightly now. "What kind of person does that?" I could sense her frustration mingling with embarrassment. "I didn't want it to come to this," I explained gently. "But you left me no choice when you kept disregarding my boundaries." Karen's friends exchanged glances before one of them finally spoke up, tentatively addressing her. Maybe it's time to rethink how we approach this situation," she suggested diplomatically. "It seems like there's been a misunderstanding." The words hung in the air like a hopeful lifeline between us. I saw a flicker of realization cross Karen's face as she glanced at her friend before returning her gaze back to me. For the first time since our conflict began, there was a hint of vulnerability in her demeanor, perhaps even an acknowledgement that my feelings were valid. "I'm just trying to be friendly," Karen replied quietly, almost as if she were trying to justify her behavior rather than confront it directly. "I didn't mean any harm." I nodded slowly, understanding that friendship is built on mutual respect and understanding boundaries. "And I appreciate that," I replied carefully, "but we have to establish limits if we're going to coexist peacefully." There was a long pause as we both processed what had just transpired. two neighbors caught in a cycle of misunderstanding and defiance finally confronted by reality. The electric fence had served its purpose. It had created a physical barrier, but also forced us both to reevaluate our roles in this ongoing saga. As Karen's friends gently encouraged her away from the scene, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with apprehension about what would happen next. Would she take this as an opportunity for growth or retreat into defiance once again? After they left, I stood by my fence feeling a strange mix of triumph and concern. Yes, I had managed to protect my property and assert my boundaries, but at what cost? The incident weighed heavily on my conscience. While I felt justified in taking action against Karen's trespassing behavior, I also worried about how far this confrontation might push our relationship and what it would mean for our community. In the days that followed, whispers circulated throughout the neighborhood about the shocking incident. Some neighbors approached me with concern, while others seemed amused by the unfolding drama. It didn't take long for word to spread about Karen's encounter with my electric fence, a topic that became fodder for casual conversations and lighthearted jokes during community gatherings. Yet beneath these lighthearted exchanges lay an undercurrent of seriousness. People began discussing boundaries and respect in their own lives. How easy it is for misunderstandings to spiral out of control when communication breaks down. Despite Karen's earlier bravado, she seemed noticeably absent from community events following the incident. I noticed her avoiding eye contact with me whenever our paths crossed, an awkwardness settling between us like an unspoken agreement not to revisit past grievances. But there was something else brewing beneath the surface, an uneasy truce formed by shared experiences rather than hostility. As days turned into weeks and life returned to its normal rhythm, I found myself cautiously optimistic that perhaps this unexpected lesson would lead us both toward better understanding one another moving forward. Though challenges still lay ahead in rebuilding trust and adjusting our interactions after such a tumultuous event, something fundamental had shifted. The electric fence had done more than just protect my property. It forced us both into a moment of reflection and growth that could pave the way for future coexistence. As summer unfolded around us with all its vibrant colors and warm breezes, I held on to hope that we might soon find common ground, perhaps even turn this conflict into an opportunity for forging new connections within our community. In the days following the shocking incident with Karen, the atmosphere in our small community shifted noticeably. News travels fast in tight-knit neighborhoods. It wasn't long before the story of my electric fence and Karen's encounter became the talk of the town. Conversations buzzed with excitement, gossip, and speculation as residents weighed in on the unfolding drama. At first, I felt apprehensive about how people would perceive me. Would they see me as a villain for taking such drastic measures to protect my property? Or would they sympathize with my plight against a neighbor who refused to respect boundaries? As I ventured out into the community, I quickly discovered that opinions were as varied as the personalities of those who lived here. During my weekly trip to the local farmer's market, I encountered Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades. She approached me with a knowing smile. "I heard about what happened with Karen," she said conspiratorially, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. "You did what you had to do. Sometimes folks need a little shock to understand boundaries." Her words broke the tension I had been feeling since the incident. It was refreshing to hear someone validate my actions, albeit in a light-hearted way. Other market-goers smiled knowingly at me as they passed by, some even giving me thumbs-up gestures or nodding in agreement. The sense of camaraderie among neighbors seemed to strengthen in response to Karen's antics. However, not everyone shared this perspective. Later that week, during a community meeting at the town hall, I found myself sitting across from a few residents who were less than pleased with how I had handled things. "We can't have people putting up electric fences," Mr. Henderson declared loudly from across the room. "What kind of message does that send about how we treat each other?" His voice was filled with indignation, and I could feel eyes shifting toward me as he continued. "We need to find ways to resolve our issues without resorting to measures that could endanger others." I listened carefully, acknowledging his concerns. "I understand where you're coming from," I replied calmly. But after repeated attempts to communicate my boundaries with Karen, and her refusal to respect them, I felt backed into a corner. The fence wasn't meant to be an aggressive gesture. It was a last resort. Mr. Henderson crossed his arms defiantly, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, several others chimed in with varying opinions, some supporting my decision while others echoed Mr. Henderson's sentiments about maintaining neighborly harmony. It became evident that our community was divided on this issue. As discussions unfolded around me, I started noticing patterns in people's reactions. Those who had experienced similar frustrations with neighbors tended to empathize with my situation, while those who valued open community spaces dismissed my actions as excessive. The conflicting views highlighted how complex living in close quarters can be. Everyone had their own thresholds for what constituted acceptable behavior and boundary setting. In the weeks following the incident, I also noticed a subtle shift in interactions between Karen and some members of the community. Initially, she seemed to retreat into herself, avoiding gatherings and even skipping out on events where she might run into me. But gradually, she started re-emerging at neighborhood functions, albeit with an air of caution. One evening at a potluck dinner hosted by another neighbor, Karen walked in looking tentative but determined. To my surprise, she approached me directly rather than avoiding eye contact like she had been doing for weeks prior. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual bravado but carrying an earnest tone instead. I wanted to apologize for how things went down. I was taken aback by her sincerity. It was a stark contrast to earlier encounters when she dismissively brushed off concerns about boundaries. "Thank you," I replied cautiously, acknowledging her effort without getting too emotional about it. "We all have our quirks," she continued, glancing around at others mingling nearby. "Maybe we just need to work on our communication." As we chatted more openly throughout the evening, it became clear that Karen was trying hard to mend fences, both literally and figuratively, and it was evident that many of our neighbors were watching this exchange closely. There was an atmosphere of curiosity among them. Perhaps they were hoping for some resolution that would allow us both to coexist peacefully without further conflict. The community's reactions played a crucial role in framing our interactions moving forward. It felt like everyone was rooting for us to find common ground rather than fueling any lingering animosity between us. In subsequent gatherings over the next few months, conversations surrounding boundaries began to pop up more frequently. People sharing stories about their own experiences navigating neighborly relationships and how they managed conflicts without resorting to extreme measures. It seemed that what began as an isolated incident had sparked broader discussions on respect and communication within our community, a positive outcome emerging from what initially felt like chaos. As summer transitioned into fall and leaves began turning shades of gold and crimson around us, there was hope lingering in the air. Perhaps Karen and I could find a way forward together, not just for ourselves, but also as part of a larger effort toward fostering understanding among neighbors. The electric fence had indeed delivered its shocking lesson, but more importantly, it had opened doors for dialogue that might lead us all toward greater harmony in our little corner of the world. As the weeks rolled on following the incident with the electric fence, I began to sense a shift in the dynamic between Karen and me. The initial tension had slowly morphed into something more tentative, a cautious approach to rebuilding our relationship. Both of us were aware that we had crossed lines, but now it felt like we were standing at crossroads, ready to choose a different path. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was raking leaves in my yard, I looked up to see Karen approaching me once again. This time, I noticed she carried something in her hands, a small basket filled with freshly baked goods. My heart raced at the sight. Was this an olive branch? "Hey there," she said, her voice softer than I had heard it in a long time. "I wanted to bring you something as a peace offering." She gestured toward the basket with a shy smile. "These are my famous pumpkin muffins." I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her gesture. It was a stark contrast to the confrontational interactions we'd had in the past. "Thank you," I replied cautiously, accepting the basket while trying to gauge her intentions. "That's really thoughtful of you. I know things got out of hand," Karen continued, her gaze earnest. "I've been reflecting on everything that happened. It's clear that I pushed your boundaries too far." I nodded, appreciating her willingness to acknowledge the situation. It was frustrating for both of us, I admitted. I just wanted to feel secure in my own space. I get that now, she replied, glancing down at her feet before looking back up at me. I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable or disrespected. The sincerity in her voice was palpable, and I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. Perhaps we could move past what had transpired and work toward a more respectful, neighborly relationship. As we chatted more casually about our lives, it became clear that beneath our previous conflict lay common ground, shared interests and mutual goals as neighbors who cared about our community. We discussed gardening tips and local events, gradually easing into a more congenial rapport. Over the next few weeks, Karen and I began interacting more frequently during community events and neighborhood gatherings. Each encounter felt like an opportunity to further mend our relationship. We would share laughs and even collaborate on small projects around our homes together. The turning point came during the annual Fall Festival, hosted in our town square. As part of the event, residents were encouraged to set up booths showcasing local crafts and homemade goodies. Karen approached me with an idea. Why not create a joint booth showcasing both of our offerings? She'd bake muffins while I prepared some of my homegrown produce for sale. At first, I hesitated, unsure if working so closely together would be wise after everything that had happened. But then I thought about how far we had come since that shocking day. Perhaps this collaboration would symbolize not only our growing friendship, but also our commitment to fostering respect for one another moving forward. So we teamed up and spent hours preparing for the festival, her baking delicious treats while I arranged fresh vegetables and herbs from my garden into colorful displays. As we worked side by side, laughter filled the air, washing away any lingering discomfort from our past encounters. On the day of the fall festival, our booth drew quite a crowd. People were excited to try Karen's muffins alongside my fresh produce. As families sampled our offerings, they complimented us on how well everything blended together, our teamwork surprising even ourselves. Throughout the event, it became clear how much progress we had made, not just as individuals, but also as representatives of our community's resilience in navigating conflict through understanding and communication. By the end of the festival, we found ourselves surrounded by laughter and warmth, not just from each other, but from neighbors who had witnessed our journey unfold over time. There was an unmistakable sense of camaraderie surrounding us now, a shared recognition that we could overcome obstacles when working together toward common goals rather than allowing misunderstandings to drive wedges between us. As twilight approached and families began packing up their belongings for home, Karen turned to me with a smile that radiated genuine happiness. "I'm really glad we did this," she said softly. "Me too," I replied warmly, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for how far we'd come together. It feels good to finally have reached some resolution. In those moments shared amid laughter and festivities, it became evident that what began as a conflict rooted in misunderstanding had blossomed into mutual respect, a testament to resilience forged through communication and compromise. As autumn leaves continued falling around us like confetti celebrating this newfound friendship, I couldn't help but reflect on how important it is to embrace challenges with open hearts, because sometimes those challenges lead us down unexpected paths toward understanding one another better than ever before. As I sat on my porch one crisp autumn evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself reflecting deeply on everything that had transpired over the months. The journey with Karen, from initial confrontation to our eventual resolution, had forced me to think critically about boundaries and what they truly mean in our lives. In many ways, my electric fence had become a physical representation of the boundaries we set for ourselves and others. At first, it felt like a last resort, an act of desperation in response to a neighbor who seemed unwilling to respect my personal space. But as time passed, I began to realize that boundaries are not merely barriers. They are essential frameworks that help define our relationships with those around us. They establish what is acceptable and what is not, allowing us to cultivate healthy interactions based on mutual respect. The incident that led to Karen's shocking lesson was a wake-up call for both of us. For her, it was a moment of reckoning, a realization that her actions had consequences and that she needed to be more mindful of the impact she had on others. For me, It was an opportunity to stand firm in my beliefs about personal space and assertiveness while also learning that communication could bridge gaps that seemed insurmountable. As I reflected on the roller coaster ride of emotions we had both experienced, I recognized how vital it is for each of us to communicate our needs clearly. Boundaries don't exist to create walls between people. Rather, they serve as guidelines that foster understanding. While I initially viewed Karen's disregard for my property as intentional disrespect, our subsequent conversations revealed her genuine desire for connection, one that simply needed clearer parameters. This realization brought me to another important aspect of boundaries: flexibility. It's easy to become rigid in our expectations, but life often demands adaptability. When Karen approached me with her peace offering of pumpkin muffins, I saw it as an opening, a chance for both of us to redefine our interactions and rebuild trust. By being willing to communicate openly and adapt our approaches, we created space for healing rather than allowing misunderstandings to fester. Moreover, my experience with Karen illuminated how the community plays a crucial role in shaping our understanding of boundaries. As neighbors observed our conflict unfold, they engaged in conversations about their own experiences navigating personal space and respect within their relationships. This collective dialogue fostered an environment where everyone felt empowered to reassess their own boundaries, something that ultimately benefited the entire community. Looking back at the community reactions during and after the incident made me appreciate how interconnected we all are. Each person's experience adds layers of complexity to the fabric of community life. When one individual navigates conflict constructively, it can inspire others to do the same. Witnessing Karen and me move from adversarial positions toward cooperation gave others hope and reinforced the idea that resolution is possible, even when things seem bleak. As autumn transitioned into winter, I felt grateful not just for the lessons learned, but also for the new friendships forged along the way. My relationship with Karen evolved beyond mere tolerance. We became allies who could support one another while respecting each other's boundaries. This shift was not only beneficial for us personally, but also served as a model for our neighbors about how conflicts could be resolved through open dialogue and mutual respect. In reflecting on boundaries, I realized they aren't static. They require ongoing negotiation and adjustment as relationships evolve over time. What works today might need reevaluation tomorrow, depending on circumstances or changes in dynamics. Recognizing this fluidity allows us to remain open-minded while ensuring we do not compromise our own needs. As winter approached and snow began dusting the ground around us, I found solace in knowing that we had created a foundation built on understanding rather than animosity. Boundaries may have started as physical lines drawn in the sand, but through communication and empathy, they transformed into bridges connecting two neighbors who once stood on opposing sides. So here I sat on my porch, a place that once felt threatened by encroachment, now transformed into a haven where laughter echoed amongst friends who respected one another's spaces. The lessons learned from my experience with Karen would stick with me as reminders of how vital it is to advocate for ourselves while remaining open-hearted toward those around us. Ultimately, boundaries shape not only our personal lives, but also define how we coexist within larger communities. Embracing them can lead us down paths of growth and connection, transforming potential conflicts into opportunities for understanding one another better than ever before. Then,